Hi, I'm Finn, and in this History Explained video, I'm going to be talking you through the character and aims of Elizabeth I. So this comes under the mid-Tudor crisis section of the AQA A Level Tudors specification, so it's still within the mid-Tudor crisis section, and it's part of those early years of Elizabeth that are still sometimes understood to be part of the mid-Tudor period. So I'm going to be, in this video, going through this set of notes that you can see on your screen, which are available on the Sociology Explained website. So if you find this helpful, go and have a look at those notes. And those notes there, as I always say, you can also get access to all of the notes, but you can also get access to all of our essay plans that apply all of this information to, I think it's over 30 possible essay questions, including some past questions and questions that we've sort of predicted could come up as well. So first of all, I'll just run through some possible kind of questions you could be asked, so some past questions on this, and then also some potential questions, as I said, that we've worked out. So in terms of past questions, lots of questions are always asking kind of compare Mary, Edward and Elizabeth. So you could be asked a question, for example, about how successful they each were in their religious policy. Also, this fits in, as I said, to that mid-Tudor crisis topic, so you could use this information to support or argue against in an essay about whether there was a crisis of government in the period, which has been asked before. Also, some questions about the source of rebellion or discontent, and perhaps weighing up factors that caused that, whether that was religious or whether that was about sort of weakness of government, etc. And you can use this information once again to argue, make an argument there. And then potential questions that we kind of identified things could come up using this content. You could potentially be given a question about how successful the restoration of Catholicism was under Mary I. And you could use this, particularly because Elizabeth, spoiler alert, is going to kind of reverse the restoration of Catholicism. So you could use this to argue that it was not sort of a full restoration because of how successfully, or maybe you say unsuccessfully, Elizabeth sort of reverses that restoration. And you can also use some of this content to think about England's international position in this period. So her early years, important to understand. She was born in 1533, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, and she was born in Greenwich Palace. And her birth followed the break with Rome, so she was born once England has sort of split up with the Pope. And of course, her mother, Anne Boleyn, was quite controversial, and therefore the legitimacy of her was kind of going to be contested from as soon as she was born, because people felt that her mother wasn't a legitimate queen. And also because Anne Boleyn had been accused of adultery and then killed in 1536, Elizabeth was then declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. However, the Third Act of Succession, 1544, restored her and said that she was legitimate. However, this obviously immediately, as with the last two monarchs too, meant that sort of was on rocky ground to begin with, and there was always going to be some debate about how legitimate she was as a monarch. Once Henry married his final wife, Catherine Parr, Elizabeth's life became a little bit more sort of consistent, and Catherine Parr insisted that Elizabeth get an education and was integrated into sort of royal politics and into the court. And yeah, when her dad died in 1547, she was only 13, and she was taken into the Parr household and sort of brought up by the Parrs. And under the reign of her half brother, she received a very strong humanist education. She became very highly skilled in languages and scholarship, and she was sort of deemed very intelligent and authoritative. You see a picture here as well of what she looked like at this age. She's quite young still. So yes, when she was in her adolescence, her life proved quite difficult, however, because she was banished from Catherine Parr's household eventually, as there were rumours that she had been entangled with her husband? Yes, Catherine Parr's, I guess she got another husband, Thomas Seymour. So yeah, she was barred from the household after rumours that she was involved with Catherine Parr's husband, Thomas Seymour. Life became increasingly dangerous for Elizabeth as well once Mary I becomes queen. Because she has a natural Protestant leaning, of course this Catholic Protestant burning Mary is going to be a bit of a problem for Elizabeth. And after Wyatt's rebellion, she is locked up in the Tower of London, and she's then kept under close supervision, I think, even if she's not in the Tower. But yeah, she was third in line to the throne after Henry died. So once Mary dies without any kids, she then becomes queen. And when she becomes queen in 1558, she is a very strong Protestant. But she's deliberately trying to be more moderate. That's an important part of sort of theme throughout Elizabeth's reign. She's not like Mary. She doesn't want to sort of persecute those who go against her religious vision. She had been shaped by Edwardian Protestantism and didn't really like the Catholic Restoration, but she avoided trying to be radical about it and wanted not to further religious division, which was obviously plaguing England at the time. So she aimed to restore royal supremacy in a sort of Protestant way, so to get rid of the Pope probably, but keep some traditional forms of Catholic worship to reduce the likelihood of widespread opposition. Her stance, therefore, was sort of shaped and is often deemed to be shaped by pragmatism. So her coronation, so in the 15th of January 1559, she has a ceremony. England's in a pretty rocky place at the time. It's financially very strained, religiously very divided, and there's a lot of uncertainty, but she has a coronation in that climate. And she was welcomed by many Protestants who were obviously happy to see the Bloody Mary gone. And then she was watched, and Catholic foreign powers were, however, quite anxious because obviously Mary had been very pro-Catholic, and they were quite concerned that this new Protestant queen could be problematic. And they watched the coronation to see how things would go down in England. Events were very carefully managed to reinforce her authority. There was a procession through London in an attempt to sort of show that she had popular support in the country and would kind of unify this mid-Tudor turmoil. But the religious elements of the coronation were at odds because she had not yet introduced her religious stance. So the church hierarchy at the time was still Catholic as she has a coronation. So she had a coronation service that kind of balanced Catholicism with her new Protestant sort of direction, which is quite symbolic for sort of how the reign of Elizabeth generally was, religiously speaking. So the aims of her first parliament. So she has the first parliament in 1559, and she focuses on stabilising the regime after all the turmoil that had thus far happened. So she establishes her goals are to establish a religious settlement. So this is to finally get sort of a settlement in England that solves all these problems of religion. She also wants to secure her legitimacy and authority because, as we've said, it's been a succession and sort of who's legitimate has been a big problem for a long time, and she wanted to make sure that she sort of had a steady footing. She also wanted to provide financial support to government and defence. So she wanted to get taxation granted and support the crown and try and stabilise England's economy as well. So key terms here when we talk about the religious settlement or the Elizabethan settlement. So a settlement is an agreement or a kind of resolution to a dispute or conflict. So in the case of the Elizabethan settlement, the settlement was designed to find a resolution to the Catholic-Protestant tension in England. So the settlement was formed in 1559 after decades of religious upheaval, and it aimed to be a kind of moderate Protestant settlement. So the idea was that people would be obedient to it, even if you were kind of a Catholic. You might say this kind of Protestantism is fine because it's less aggressive. It was also shaped by its kind of political circumstances. Many bishops in the House of Lords were still conservatives and they were still Catholics, so she couldn't pass anything too radical by them. And it was established through two fundamental pieces of legislation, which was the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity. So the Act of Supremacy in 1559 restores the Crown's authority over the Church. So the Pope, once again, is no longer the head of the Church, but instead the Queen is. And this has clergy and royal officials therefore have to swear allegiance to or make an oath recognising this authority. And then the Crown also gains authority over church appointments, etc. And then you have the Act of Uniformity in 1559, so the same year. This was an act that was a sort of established a single legally required form of worship across England. So every church in the country had to sort of follow this way of worshipping, and it introduced a Book of Common Prayer. So that's a book that basically tells you how to pray or how to run church services. So it required attendance at all church services, which meant that it would sort of mean that everyone outwardly was showing that they were committed to this new religious settlement, and penalties were therefore introduced for non-attendance. So it became a sort of very public matter that you had to sort of show your allegiance to the settlement by going to church. So Elizabeth's relationship with Parliament, 1558 to 63, which is obviously the period that this covers. So in the first Parliament in 1559, there's a great deal of cooperation between the two. Elizabeth relies on Parliament to get her settlement through, and to grant her taxation. And most MPs accepted this. They wanted the turmoil to be over. So as I said, they were quite cooperative, and there was kind of constructive relations. Even if some leading Catholic lords were resistant, overall it was broadly cooperative. Then you have some growing friction later on, as MPs increasingly want to pressure Elizabeth to marry someone or to name a successor, because at this point nobody really knew who was going to be the next ruler, because Elizabeth had no kids, Mary had no kids, people didn't really know who it was supposed to be, and she wasn't married, so there was no indication that she was going to have a baby or going to produce an heir, so it was quite unsure, and Parliament was increasingly getting frustrated about this, and it was often debated in Parliament, but she managed largely to squash that and say that was none of their business, basically. And then you have the second Parliament of 1563, where there is once again still a decent level of cooperation. They supported Elizabeth with legislation and with finance, but once again the succession issue comes back, and Elizabeth is getting increasingly resistant to this, and sort of seeing Parliament as being kind of invasive and overstepping the mark when they're trying to pressure her to have a baby, which I guess makes sense. So generally a pattern was emerging that Elizabeth worked with Parliament when she needed them, but she was very strict when it came to their influence over sensitive matters, and was often sort of disciplining them there. So then there's sort of two views on this. There's the J.E. Neal view, and then there is the revisionist view. So once again, it's important to understand sort of what historians have said about the period, for a couple of reasons. One, it can help you think of what you think about the period, and what you might want to argue in an essay. But also, if you are aware of the different views of different historians, that could be very helpful in preparing you for the interpretations you might have to read in the interpretations question in the exam, because you'll already sort of be aware of different arguments and be able to criticise them with some level of confidence. So the J.E. Neal view, which was argued in the Elizabethan House of Commons, which is in 1949, so it's an old book, he particularly sort of came up with this idea of the Puritan choir thesis, which is something we'll talk about in later videos as well. And his view was that there was a sort of strong group of Protestant MPs in Parliament at this time, who were increasingly hostile to Elizabeth, and this really increased tension. And she was particularly trying to control this Protestant choir, he called them. But then there's the revisionist view, which is sort of opposes this view that there was a sort of single Protestant group in Parliament, and it argues that these historians argue that Neal's kind of wrong to see this one sort of driving force in politics. It says that MPs were generally more guided by specific issues that were quite temporary and often driven by local concerns as well, and there wasn't this sort of coordinated Protestant ideology within Parliament. And they generally argue that Elizabeth was quite effective through her management of Parliament and the Privy Council, and that MPs' interventions were often sort of on issues of succession or religion, and were normally framed as being about a kind of concern for the Queen and concern for the Crown. So this sort of has a more positive spin, therefore, on Elizabeth's relationship with Parliament. So then you have the succession crisis of 1562 as a kind of key event here. So Elizabeth gets very ill in 1562. She gets smallpox, and people think she's going to die, and they're very worried that she's going to die because she, as I said before, has no successors, and people don't know who would become king, and they think it's going to trigger a great deal of conflict in the country, perhaps even civil war or foreign intervention, as a foreign ruler might see this sort of power vacuum in the country and swoop in. So as she gets ill, Parliament gets increasingly stressed and kind of aggressive about the idea of the succession. However, she actually recovers from smallpox, but it's an important point in showing the tension developing there. So then there's the issue of marriage. So in response to this, Elizabeth is still very reluctant to pick a husband, which gains her the title of the Virgin Queen. But Parliament is, as I said, also stressed about her getting married. They want her to get married. The reason she was reluctant to marry, however, it's interesting that she resisted this so much. Obviously, Mary did get married. She was probably reluctant to relinquish any control, because if she married a king, particularly a foreign king, she might have to sort of he might challenge her independence and her power. She also didn't necessarily want to get pregnant at the time, because at this point you often died. It was pretty common. So she didn't particularly want to die, I guess, obviously. Also, she was very worried, particularly about marrying a foreign prince, and how this could provoke hostility and make England subordinate to another power. She also worried about what it would do domestically, as different factions within the country would kind of support different possible marriages, which might create sort of a destabilised politics. And there's also a great deal of religious complications. So Catholics and Protestants are sort of, who does she marry and who will this annoy? If she marries a Protestant, obviously it will annoy a lot of Catholics, and so on. She also, if she wasn't married, was able to sort of use marriage negotiations or offer to marry people as a sort of form of diplomatic leverage for foreign policy. If she said, I might marry you, it might win her some support abroad. And then also, there's obviously personal reasons she probably didn't want to get married either. She had seen her mother's fate after getting married. She'd also seen how unpopular Mary I was after she got married to Philip of Spain. So perhaps she just wanted to avoid the whole thing and continue being this image of the Virgin Queen. So here's a little table comparing what she was kind of like as a leader. So was she a cautious monarch? You could argue yes. She sort of had this personal survival experience. She'd been imprisoned by her sister, and it encouraged her to be quite hardy, I guess, but also, be moderate and avoid this sort of particularly divisive politics. Also, her legitimacy was somewhat fragile, as we spoke about earlier. She'd been written off and then put back on, blah, blah, blah. And this meant that she was kind of careful to, once again, sort of maintain an image of legitimacy and not have it undermined. England, of course, was also very religiously divided, and she wanted a moderate approach to this to avoid instability. She was unmarried, of course, without an heir, which meant she had incentives to avoid any conflict. And she needed elite cooperation. She depended on the Privy Council and the nobility. So this encouraged her to be pragmatic rather than radical, so she didn't kind of make any enemies there. And then the other side of the argument, that Elizabeth may be a bit more, she might shake things up, basically. And she had this strong humanist education, so she had this different approach. She was very well educated, and this might encourage her to have a more innovative government. She was also very conscious of public image. So she was very keen on public messaging and sort of how she was perceived by the public and by elite. So that meant that she might do a lot to sort of curate a particular image. She's politically flexible, so she was able to survive the last two regimes that were very different. And the fact that she was able to do this suggests maybe that she was quite adaptable and strong there. There was the potential she had to kind of reframe female monarchy, because she was an unmarried queen. She could reshape kind of the idea of authority, and it was the idea that she was married to England or she was married to the realm. And although it undermined her at many times, her gender and how she used it could also perhaps fuel her power and give her some authority. There was also opportunity created by crisis. because there had been so much go on for the last few years, it had the mid-Tudor crisis as it's known, Elizabeth had the opportunity to kind of reshape how things were done in England. So that's everything for this sort of first look at Elizabeth I and her character and aims. There's obviously a whole other section of the specification all about Elizabeth I's sort of later government that goes all the way to 1603. So more to come on her. And as I said, if you found this helpful, go and have a look at those notes on the History Explained website.